The coldest you have ever been, you were probably minutes from a warm room. In March of 1999, on a volcano called Llullaillaco, 3 climbers were living at 22,000 feet. Johan Reinhard's trowel scrapes frozen gravel from a buried stone platform. Volcanic rock. Then woven cloth. Under 5 feet of rubble sits a small bundled figure wrapped in fine cloth, knees drawn to her chest. She is 500 years old, and she looks asleep. Her arms are folded around her knees, her head tipped gently forward. Whoever wrapped her with care. No decay and no damage, skin, braided hair, even eyelashes, all held by the cold. Doctors will later find her organs whole, a last meal in her stomach, frozen blood still in her heart. The team had not come to climb. This was an archaeological expedition, camped 1,000 feet below the summit, digging whenever the wind allowed. The find had cost weeks of storms that flattened the tents, and it had cost Johan Reinhard 20 years of searching summits exactly like this one.
Hold on. There's cloth here. Nobody move.
And she was not alone. In 2 more pits nearby lay a boy of about 7 and a girl even younger, 3 children, arranged on one summit. Around the children sat the wealth of an empire in miniature, gold and silver figurines dressed in woven cloaks, feathered headdresses still standing, pottery that still held food. Nothing lives at this height. No birds, no insects, almost nothing that can rot. The same dead cold that took her breath kept her body for 5 centuries. And the platform under her was no accident of geology. Cut stone, leveled and set by human hands, the Inca built this place higher than they built anything else. Archaeologists call this the highest archaeological site on Earth, and the Inca climbed this mountain carrying 3 children. The nearest water is a day's walk below, the nearest village too. Nothing up here sustains life. There was no reason to build on this summit, except the one the Inca had. To understand why, you have to leave the summit, 500 years back to a city of temples called Cusco. A procession is leaving the capital, priests, guards, llamas loaded with offerings, and walking at the center, the children the empire has chosen. The Inca never hid what happened on these peaks. They planned it for months and they celebrated it. The question is why, and the answer is bigger than religion. Cusco was the center of the largest empire in the Americas, roughly 10 million people, ruled from one mountain valley. Its ruler was called the Sapa Inca, the only Inca, and the empire treated him as the sun's own son. What he required, provinces provided. Every few years, imperial officials walked the provinces with one task: find the most beautiful, most flawless children in the empire. The chosen girls disappeared into walled houses called Acalahuasi, the houses of the chosen, where they learned to weave the empire's finest cloth and brew its sacred beer. Perfection had a price. In one village stood a girl of maybe 13, no scars, braided hair. The officials chose her almost at a glance. For the girl's family, this was loss and honor at once, a daughter taken and a household raised in the eyes of the state. The chosen children traveled to Cusco from every corner of the empire, some walking for weeks before they ever saw the capital. In the capital, the children of every province were gathered before the temple, small travelers from 4 quarters of the empire, presented together in one plaza. In Cusco, they were feasted like nobility, seated with lords, dressed in fine cloth, honored in ceremonies that lasted for days. The girl was dressed by the state itself, Kumbi cloth, the grade of weaving reserved for nobility and gods, pinned with silver. For 1 year, she outranked almost everyone she had ever met. Lords bowed to the child a village had raised, the empire's favor, worn like a garment. 500 years later, laboratory tests on the frozen girl can read that year of honor in her hair. Hair grows about ½ an inch a month, and it keeps what the body was eating. A braid is a calendar, written in chemistry. Chemistry in hair and bone shows her diet transformed in the final year, from potatoes and greens to maize and llama meat, the food of the elite. Whatever was coming had a schedule. The elevation began roughly 12 months before she died. None of this was improvised. Priests fixed dates, provinces sent offerings, and the state assembled a procession worthy of a god. Storehouses opened along the road ahead. Gold, cloth, coca, chicha, a state machine turning, all of it pointed at one departure. On the morning of departure, the girl walked out of Cusco at the center of a column of priests, llamas, and offering. The column turned south toward the high peaks, Behind her, the gates closed on a city she was never meant to see again. The empire's roads ran for thousands of miles, and the column followed them south across the high plateau. The Hapak Nan, the royal road, ran 25,000 miles through the mountains, and for the column, every mile of it was staged, stocked, and expected. Every night ended at a way station stocked by the state, food, shelter, and fresh escorts waiting in the dark. Each station was stocked before she arrived. Dried llama meat, maize, firewood hauled up from the valleys of the Andes. The empire fed her forward, station by station. The girl walked with her own small load, spare sandals, a bag of coca leaf, tiny pots of food, and her drinking cup. Everything she owned would climb with her. Along the way, the girl was given chicha, maize beer, and coca leaf, sacred and steadying and constant.
Eating me, mama.
The girl's hair keeps the record. Chemical markers for coca and alcohol climb week by week and surge in her final weeks. Researchers read the pattern as ceremony, sacred substances rising as the ritual approached its end. Past the last village, the road gave out, and the column started climbing into a world with no people in it. On the volcano's flank, the empire had raised way camps at 17,000 feet, stone rooms in a place where even sleep is work. The Inca had built for this climb, stone shelters stepping up the volcano, higher than anything else they ever made. Reinhard's team found those same stone rooms still standing and slept beside them, 500 years of wind between the two camps. In 1999, with modern storm gear and mountaineering training, Johan Reinhard's team could barely hold the same ground. Storms pinned the team in their tents for days, at temperatures far below freezing, in air with half the oxygen of sea level. Reinhard's team in 1999 carried satellite phones, foam sleeping mats, gas stoves, and still measured their progress in hours of digging per day. At this height, every body burns itself just to stay warm, and hers was a child's body, doing a soldier's climb. The girl made this same climb in sandals and wool, one steadying hand at her elbow, one ridge at a time. Above the shelters, the wind becomes the only voice. Nothing else up here moves or sounds. The loudest thing on Llullaillaco is your own breath. The final camp sat so high that the escorts themselves began to fail. From here, only the essential party climbed, the priests, the offerings, and the children. Near the top, the ceremony's destination came into view, a stone platform built where the sky begins. After months of roads and weeks of cold, the column went quiet. The walking was over. What waited now was the ceremony itself. Step back from one mountain, and a pattern appears. The high shrines cluster along the empire's edges, and the edges kept moving. In roughly 1 century, the Inca went from a single valley to an empire stretching more than 2,000 miles of mountains. Speed like that creates a problem. The conquered lands were full of peoples with their own lords, their own languages, and their own gods. A growing number of archaeologists read the mountain ceremonies as an answer to that problem, statecraft, written in ritual. In this reading, the procession itself was the message. The capital's power walking through newly conquered valleys for months, impossible to miss. The children came from the provinces, and the provinces were bound by the gift, families honored, local lords tied to Cusco by something no treaty could match. And above every bound province stood the proof, a shrine at the top of the sky, holding a child of the empire. The map fits the idea. The highest shrines stand far from the capital, and Llullaillaco itself rises on the empire's southern frontier. Not everyone reads it that way. Spanish chronicles tie the ceremonies to calendars, to a ruler's death, to droughts and disasters, and the debate is still open. One chronicle cuts closest. In 1621, a Spanish priest recorded the story of Tanta Carhua, a girl given to the mountains, and of her father who rose to lead his village because he gave her. Villagers told the priest that Tanta Carhua still answered them as an oracle, a child who became a god, and a family that became nobility. That is the machine seen from inside. Honesty matters here. The Inca wrote nothing down. Their records were knotted cords, and the chronicles we have were written by their conquerors. But the pattern keeps pulling one way. The expense, the publicity, the frontier peaks, it reads like an empire speaking to its provinces. Whatever the empire meant by it, the ceremony had reached its final night. On the platform, the column lit its fires against the dark. On the platform, the ceremony filled the final night. Songs, offerings, and the thin air doing its quiet work. Spanish chroniclers describe nights like this one. Songs until dawn, offerings burned in pairs, the children honored at the center. The girl was given more chicha than ever before. Researchers believe she was deeply sedated, warm inside the cloth and drifting. Around her they set what she would need: her cups, her food, the little llamas of gold and silver that the Inca gave their chosen, her sandals for the road ahead. The girl was left seated in her niche, wrapped against the stone. The studies agree on this much: she was asleep, and the cold did the rest. The researchers, who came to call her the maiden, found no violence in her body and no struggle in her posture. She had eaten, she had drunk, and she had fallen asleep and was never moved again. The two younger children were placed in niches of their own. For them, the evidence is harder to read and harder to hear. Yet the platform was sealed with rubble and offerings, and the mountain took over 500 years of frost, wind, and silence. The cold held everything in place. Only once did the world reach in, a lightning strike, finding the smallest of the three. Back in 1999, the excavation reached all three niches, and the team faced a new problem: how to move them without losing them. Frozen for 5 centuries, the children could be destroyed by a single warm afternoon. The team carried them down packed in snow, racing the sun.
Keep her in the shade. We move after sunset. She cannot warm.
Today, the three rest in Salta, in a museum built around them, refrigerated capsules holding the mountains cold, one child on view at a time.
Yeah.
The museum in Salta keeps each capsule at the summit's own cold. The air dried to match, a mountain rebuilt around 3 children in a city block. The display itself is debated. Indigenous communities call the children ancestors taken from their mountain. Researchers answer that they still teach. Visitors stand in front of the girl for a long time. 500 years after the ceremony, her calm is the hardest thing in the room. One question is left, and it is the oldest one: what did the empire actually buy with her life? The answer is waiting where this began: the same stones, the same thin air, and the question still circling: what did the empire buy? Reinhard's team packed out in silence. The mountain that had kept its secret for 5 centuries was empty again, and the questions came down with the children. Here's what the evidence actually proves. The children were real, honored, and prepared for a year. The ceremony was planned like a campaign, and the empire carried it to its farthest edges. And here's what stays argued: whether those peaks were flags of empire, offerings to mountain gods, or both at once. The honest answer is that the debate is alive. 5 centuries on, her hair still holds the year of feasts, her stomach the last meal, her lungs the thin air. No chronicle survives that speaks as clearly as the maiden does. Then history delivered its verdict on the empire itself. Within a lifetime of the ceremony, strangers from the sea took Cusco, and the empire that planned everything was gone. The empire that moved 10 million people fell in a handful of years. Smallpox ran ahead of Pizarro's men. Civil war ran beside them. The roads emptied. The way stations fell. The language of the ceremonies faded, and the children stayed exactly where the empire left them. The last Capacocha processions stopped within a generation. The mountains kept their children, but nobody climbed to visit them anymore. The road up from Cusco had lost its reason. The empire's borders are gone. Its records are knots nobody can fully read. What survived perfectly, impossibly, is what it spent on the mountain: her. Spanish priests spent the next century hunting the mountain shrines, burning the offerings they could reach. The highest ones they simply could not reach. Her altitude was her protection. So what did the empire buy? On the evidence, a bond stronger than any it could write, paid in the only currency that could not be faked. And the bond held longer than the empire did. Villages below the Andes peaks kept the shrine names, kept the stories. Some still leave offerings on the lower slopes today. But arguments are for the living. The girl on the mountain was 13, and beloved and brave in a way nobody should have to be. But Johan Reinhard searched 20 years and found her in one afternoon. When he speaks of her now, it is the way people speak of a person, not a find. In Salta, the capsule holds its summit cold, and visitors keep going quiet in front of her. The ceremony still working 500 years on. 500 years on, the empire is a story, and she is still here, asleep above the clouds, holding its last true claim. Up next, the pirate city that sank in 3 minutes. Dive in.